Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory to Christ.
It's good to see you tonight as we begin part 2 in our ongoing series, Stories of Orthodox America. And as I note in the title, this is an informal history. While I am trained historically, I have a master's in history, this is not that necessarily. This is a little different. So last week we began by telling the story of the Alaskan Orthodox community and all that is involved in that. Just to review a bit, we have a timeline of things that happened. In 1741, the Russians began to visit Alaska, and they began, most of their trappers and traders with the native Alaskans, acquiring goods, natural goods from Alaska. In the 1760s, we mentioned, kind of by contrast, a Greek group of indentured servants were in Florida, New Smyrna Beach, and St. Augustine. They did not remain Orthodox, but that's part of the Greek story. And then in 1794, we have the first Russian mission arrive from Valam Monastery to begin evangelizing the native peoples of Alaska. And of course, from that, we have the stories of St. Herman. We mentioned St. Peter the Aleut, the first young native-born martyr. We have St. Innocent of Alaska and his incredible work as a priest and then as a bishop. St. Yaakov Nietzvetov, the first native-born priest beginning his ministry. And then the other great figures of the Alaskan church, leading up to St. Innocent being recalled back to Russia, where he became Metropolitan of Moscow, and St. Yaakov dying in the 1860s. And then, of course, we got to the sale of Alaska in 1867, a major date in the history of Orthodox America. And so I mentioned last week, actually, at the end of our talk on the Alaskan church, I mentioned that one of the bishops, this is Bishop Nicholas Zyorov, he was bishop in the 1890s in America, was a very good bishop, by the way. He defended the natives very boldly, and I read the letter of Bishop Nicholas to President McKinley about the depredations of this guy, Sheldon Jackson. I thought I had this slide. I didn't have it last week. I wanted to share that slide. So you just see the cast of characters. It's kind of good to have a mental image placing our Orthodox history in the American history as well. So President McKinley, that era of American history. Okay, so we began last week with a question. What is the first Orthodox parish in Kentucky? And of course, we talked about all the possibilities there. We mentioned that Assumption Greek Orthodox Church might be the oldest. It's in Louisville. We mentioned also St. Michael's has a claim to be the oldest for various reasons, depending on how you date things. We even mentioned that the story of this community, Panagia Panta Vasilisa, the Greek church in Lexington, now Holy Mother Queen of all, I think, even their story goes back to the early 1900s in Turkey and then in Greece and then coming to Lexington. Very beautiful, interesting stories. And even St. Andrew's, while it's not the oldest at all, it's the first kind of intentionally missional parish in Kentucky and has that identity. And St. Athanasius followed behind, being the first OCA parish with that missional identity as well. So there's a lot of history here. And I mentioned, too, one of my favorite stories. Brother Gary had alerted me to the fact that in Lynch, Kentucky, we have a very old Orthodox foundation. And we talked about that history a bit and how bizarre and funny some of those stories are, including the names. Was it St. Nicholas Eastern Rite Orthodox Catholic Church, or was it the Lynch Greek Orthodox Church, or the Lynch Greek Catholic Church? Or was it in Nativity Theotokos Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church of North America? What was it? And there's all these different answers you can find in the record. Be that as it may, it did not endure. That parish only lasted for less than a decade. And we noted that today it was a Baptist church for a while and then became a community center at some point in the last 50 years. So which one's the oldest? Who knows? And that's part of where we're setting up things for tonight. But it brings up questions. What is a parish? What conditions indicate an actual beginning to a parish? Are we speaking of continual existence or not? These are important questions. And what kind of story is being told? So with that, let us turn a bit to the first Orthodox parish in the lower 48. This era we're talking about tonight is underlying developing missions and mass immigration into America. This is the category from 1860s, Civil War era, sale of Alaska era, up to 1914, which is what? World War I, and then 1917, the Russian Revolution. We'll talk next week about why these dates are really, this bracketing of time is really important in the history of North American Orthodoxy. But we're focusing on this period here, this great period of immigration and developing of our church. So what's the first parish in the lower 48? Well, there are two candidates. Anyone know what they might be?
Orthodox.
Well, that's interesting. Who said that? That is a really interesting answer, actually. Thank you. That throws a little, muddies the water a bit. Good. What are the two I'm looking for?
San Francisco.
San Francisco, which church? The True Church. No. Holy Trinity Orthodox Cathedral, which is the OCA San Francisco Cathedral. Not to be confused with the ROCOR, as Holy Trinity Cathedral, I think, as well. Anyway, our cathedral, we'll talk about the history of that church, but that's one candidate. What's the other candidate? I'll give you a hint. It involves that. That's the icon of what? Or a very bad icon of what?
The Trinity.
The Trinity, yeah. Actually, both churches that claim the title First Orthodox Church in America are called Holy Trinity. We have Holy Trinity in San Francisco, OCA, and we have Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church in which city? New Orleans. New Orleans. It's a very interesting history. And by the way, I put that bad icon up because in that era, if you had an icon of the Holy Trinity, it would have been the bad icon at that point. Just anywhere you go in old parish, you find the Trinity icon, it's going to be the old man, the boy, and the bird, and just accept it, even though it's not considered good. So anyway, that's in the spirit of that time. So we have Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church Cathedral in New Orleans, and we have the Holy Trinity Orthodox Cathedral in San Francisco. And they're very different histories, but very close in time. And we're going to look at their stories. By the way, I have two personal connections. Anyone know this guy right here? Father George Wilson, who was at Panagia for many years. My good friend, Father George, is now the dean of the cathedral in New Orleans. So a friend of our parish is the rector there, the dean. And then my good friend, Father Kirill Sokolov from seminary, is the dean of our cathedral, OCA Cathedral in San Francisco. So I'm very fond of both. I have friends in both these places. They're both wonderful churches. There's a great history in both places. This is a lot of fun for me because they're people that I know. And in fact, Father Kirill's father was a longtime dean of the cathedral before he died. So there's like a whole heritage thing going on there. Okay, so the case for Trinity Greek Orthodox Church in New Orleans. Various Greeks tried to establish a community in New Orleans during the Civil War. The only thing they succeeded in doing, they raised a Confederate regiment to fight for the South. The Greeks did in New Orleans. They couldn't build a church, though. Later on, between 1864 and 67, they had sporadic lay services at the Benaki residence in New Orleans, a home owned by a Greek magnate there. And then in 1865, they had a priest serve a liturgy. He was actually kind of a vagante priest, kind of traveling through. It was a big deal in the media. The first Greek Orthodox liturgy in New Orleans, but no priest living there. And then in 1867, they brought in Father Stephen Andreades from Greece to be the full-time pastor of their community. And he arrived and intended to stay for, we know from his letters, he wanted to stay for a long time. That was the plan. He only stayed for 5 years, but from that point on, we kind of have continuous priestly coverage in New Orleans at the Greek church there. And that was, I think, one of the earlier buildings they used there in New Orleans. So you have the dates 1864, you have 1867, 65. All of these dates are possible start times for this cathedral, for this church. The case for Holy Trinity OCA is similar. In 1857, the First Orthodox Society of San Francisco was founded by the Russians who were there, because of course San Francisco is near the Russian territories. It's a point of trade between the U.S. and the Russian Empire. In 1867, that society became the Greek, Russian, Slavonian, Orthodox, Eastern Church, and Benevolent Society. We like long names. And so that was incorporated as a thing, as a church. And then in this decade between 57 and 67, that entire time, Russian ships would come through, and they had chaplains on board, especially Navy boats, would have a priest, and they'd just invite the priest to their chapel. He would serve the liturgy, and they'd have kind of services whenever they had chaplains in town. And so there was a sense of community of some sort. And by 1868, one of these chaplains, Father Nikolai Kovrigin, had settled as the permanent priest in San Francisco. And so sometime between 1857 and 68, you can say the OCA parish was founded there in San Francisco. And it's funny, Matthew Naming says, in the end, I think the race between New Orleans and San Francisco for the title of First Orthodox Parish is too close to call. And so there's all these questions. What is a parish? Is it continuous? Is there a priest there? Do they have a building? Is it just sporadic? All these questions are important as we think about kind of church history in our land. So let's talk about this outline of this period, 1860s to 1917. We see, in this period, we see the founding of the Holy Trinity churches, both of those churches in the 1860s, however you want to map that out. We have the Purchase of Alaska, 1867. We have the next year, the Russian church establishes their parish formally, at least, in 1868. And then the Russian bishop moves his see from Alaska to San Francisco in the 1872. And then in the 1880s, huge waves of immigration begin from Eastern Southern Europe, and it begins to peak in the 1890s. In 1889, future St. Alexis Toth arrives from Austria-Hungary to America as sort of an immigrant with his itinerant flock of people who are moving from their village in Austria-Hungary and what is now Slovakia, Ukraine, over into Minneapolis. In 1898, St. Tikhon arrives in America as her youngest bishop yet. He serves until 1907. And then we have, just in general, the whole turn of the century, at least for the future OCA, is dominated by the story of Uniats, Byzantine Catholics converting to Orthodoxy. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then sort of our last big date here in tonight's sequence is the consecration of Bishop Raphael Halloini, who becomes St. Raphael later in the 20th century. So with that, let's plow into some of these things. There are also, in addition to these events, there's a series of themes that I think we want to be mindful of tonight as well. The biggest theme, of course, is massive immigration. 27.5 million Europeans, not other Europeans, immigrate between 1865 and 1915, actually, is what the date was in my research. And perspective here. Now we have 300 million Americans, and you can imagine 27 million coming in the next however many years here, and that's 10% of the population. At the time that the Civil War ended, in 1865, our population was about 30 million. So in one generation, or a little bit more, you double the country by immigration alone, not counting all the kids they're going to have and all that brings to the United States of America. It was an incredible, shocking change for American society. Early on, immigration was perhaps more Americanish. You had people who were from Great Britain, from Ireland, from Germany, from Scandinavia. These were mostly Protestants, some Catholics with the Irish. They were also discriminated against as Irish Catholics. They had a really tough time here. But they were starving from the potato famine, and they crowded on boats and came to America and settled all along the East Coast. So early on, it was that sort of Northern European immigration. But the later period, especially the 1890s on, you have people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Greece, Italy, the Balkans. That includes Albania, Serbia, all these kind of places, Bulgaria. And in that crowd are lots of Roman Catholics, lots of Orthodox Christians, and lots of Jews. So it's a very different kind of immigrant coming in this period, which is important because it meant that their lot in life was a bit tougher. You see a lot of anti-immigration sentiment, not surprisingly, given that that's such a huge number. You see cultural clashes, etc. So that's a major theme, immigration. Another is the missionary conversion of both an unsuccessful and successful type. Orthodoxy is defined in this era by missionary conversions, good kinds, helpful kinds, and disastrous kinds. We'll talk about both of those in a bit. And then we have Orthodoxy is characterized by a shockingly wide assortment, both in terms of quality and sanity of church leadership and the Orthodox communities. And we'll talk about some of those characters as well. So, and all these things really impact the story of Orthodoxy in America. So, let's start with the leadership challenge. We'll go backwards. We'll start backwards. We'll go bottom to top. Okay. So, Metropolitan St. Innocent, of course, being our first bishop, was excited to have America. He was in support of America buying Alaska. He wanted to connect the Alaskan diocese to the American mainland and spread Orthodoxy through that way. But he was never able to see that as bishop because by the time Alaska was sold, he was on his way to Moscow to become Metropolitan of Moscow. So he was not on site to help us make that transition, unfortunately, because he was a great visionary. The first bishop in this period after the sale of Alaska would have been Bishop John Mitropolsky. He was bishop for about 7 years. He was scholarly and visionary, but not very dynamic. He loved English language. He loved serving in English. He was the first person to sort of translate books into English and began to do services in English. But of course, it annoyed the Slavs he served. So there's a lot of tension under him because the Slavs want everything in Russian, and he has this visionary mentality, but he's not a very good leader. And so his ministry was very temporary and sort of transitional. In this period that America had begun to, Orthodoxy began to grow in the lower 48. We also then had Bishop Nestor Zakis. He was only bishop for about 3 years. And you see the gap, by the way. Look, you got a 3-year gap between Bishop John and Bishop Nestor. They were very happy to have Bishop Nestor. They finally had a bishop after 3 years and no bishop. He was very talented. He advocated for Alaskan natives very effectively. He loved to write letters. He corresponded with President Rutherford B. Hayes about the natives and support of them, and he found the president very helpful, at least. He helped develop a script for the Orthodox Eskimos, so they have their own version of the scriptures. He really cared about all these. He was very academic, very interesting man. And part of it was, who do you get to be bishop in America? You can't have just a normal Russian pastor because he doesn't speak English. You end up with guys who are really heady and kind of unusual, who like foreign cultures, and those guys become your candidates to go to America. So you get a weird group. So these are both good guys, but very strange. He had I'm not going to read the whole story of his demise, but he had what some called in that day neuralgia. Perhaps we'd call it maybe something like, what do you call those bad headaches? Migraines. Perhaps it was migraines. And they were terrible, and he would get out of sort for days and be testy and angry and hide in his room and kind of like, he was on a voyage either from Alaska to the San Francisco. I forget which way he was going, but he was going somewhere on a boat off the west coast of the United States. And the captain checked on him, and then 30 minutes later someone else tried to find him, and he was gone. They knew he'd had an episode of this neuralgia or something, and he'd been in pain for a couple of days. He disappears. And it becomes a question, what happened to him? He's gone from the boat. They stop the boat. They look around. There's no trace of the poor bishop. And it was presumed by the captain, at least, that he had jumped off the boat, perhaps to stop the headache or something. And yet, you read the papers later, when the ship gets back to San Francisco, the Russian consul is wondering, was he killed? Was it murder, foul play? So there's all this sort of scandal about how the bishop might have died. Because if it's suicide, that's a scandal, right? If it's murder, that's a scandal. No matter how maybe someone pushed him accidentally. No one knows. But he died, and it was sort of a tragedy. The diocese was crestfallen because they finally had a bishop, and after 3 years, he died, and he jumped off the boat or something, or was pushed off the boat. It's a very strange story for the ending of a very strange man. And then they get this guy. Bishop Vladimir Sokolovsky was bishop for only 3 years. And note again, we have a significant gap between Bishop Nestor and Bishop Vladimir. He was very intelligent. He was very well trained. He loved languages. He was cultured. He also made people mad because he loved serving in English. I'm going to read a bit about him. There was a big scandal involving him. Bishop Vladimir arrived to find a pretty bleak situation at the cathedral in San Francisco. Despite the Russian government subsidizing the diocese and its 9 parishes to the tune of a reported $53,000, which is $1.8 million in today's dollars, that's a lot of money. That's as much as our entire diocese of the South right now, I think. The Chronicle of San Francisco reported practically there is no congregation in the city. Not infrequently, the services of the cathedral are conducted in an empty church, the only persons present being the priests and members of the choir. At the Christmas and Easter services, there might be perhaps 100 people in the whole cathedral. But Vladimir, it was said, was a man on a mission. The Chronicle reported repeated complaints that he had ignored the needs of the Alaskans in favor of a push to convert Americans to Orthodoxy. He announced that church services in his cathedral would now be held only in English. And he brought in a throng of young students from Russia to attend the cathedral school. He began a project to enlarge and renovate the cathedral. Many of the community's old guard weren't on board with any of this new program. And so the parish divided into 2 factions with different Serbian family clans sticking out their own interests. So the Serbs were involved, Russians involved, and it describes this bitter fight between the Serbs of one family, another family, Russians threatening legal action, the poor bishop being caught between them and being very ineffective as a leader. But this is only part of Bishop Vladimir's problems. He brought over a bunch of Russian boys to live at the school connected to the parish. Accusations began circulating that conditions at the school were abysmal and that the bishop himself had abused the boys. There was, it was said, a dungeon and slavery and torture. The local Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children got involved. One of the boys sued Vladimir for back pay, claiming he'd been basically enslaved for 2 years at the bishop's residence. And Matthew Namey says, I won't repeat every charge against the bishop except to say that the allegations included the worst things you can imagine short of murder. There's a whole book about this mess, and he cites the name of the book. If you want to read more, I won't cite it, but it's there. The author of the book, retired Stanford professor Terrence Emmons, doesn't have a favorable view of Bishop Vladimir at all, and the book itself is well written, but absolutely gut-wrenching to read and not in any way edifying. I cite it only to say that books could be written about the Bishop Vladimir crisis, and one has been written. In the middle of all this, in the spring of 1891, a delegation from St. Alexis Toth's Uniat Parish in Minneapolis arrived in San Francisco seeking to join the Orthodox Church. It's remarkable that just as utter chaos and scandal reigned in San Francisco, the great return to the Unia, the great missionary effort of St. Alexis Toth, was beginning. So it's an incredible, weird story. Bishop Vladimir died with the church. He had the reputation of being a holy ascetic. And Matthew Namey says, I'm not aware of any further allegations against him apart from those in San Francisco. Most accounts about him that you'll find online or in print gloss over San Francisco, presenting him as a forward-thinking bishop who happened to have a very short tenure in America. The real question, which I cannot answer, is was he a monster or was he the victim of slander? And he says there's no way to know. He might have been a victim of conspiracy and people just saying evil things about him, or he might have been a really horrible person, and we won't know based on the evidence. But I mean, that all hell broke loose in our diocese, and that was the very same time that you're seeing this incredible upsurge in Orthodox interest. So here's Bishop number 3 in this list. And then we had the same year actually that Bishop Vladimir left, we got Bishop Nicholas Ziorov, who was an incredibly gifted bishop, a very good hierarch of our diocese in America. And he basically didn't get in the way of what God was doing. People flooded the churches. He blessed new priests to come to America. He ordained many fine clergymen. He recruited people from Russia to come and serve in his churches. He coordinated beautifully the visitations and the construction of churches, and overall did a very good job as bishop in that time period. So we have finally, the last bishop of the 19th century is Bishop Tikhon Belavin. Who is that? Who's Bishop Tikhon? We know him. Saint Tikhon, right? Saint Tikhon, the Patriarch of Moscow. We were lucky enough to have him for a period of, 9 years in America. He was our bishop and archbishop. And he advanced an incredible vision for Orthodoxy, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So this is our leadership. We had saints in this leadership. We had people that might be really terrible. We had bishops who were ineffective, bishops who were very good. We have all of them here. And you see this is an important part of our story. And it's these bishops who oversaw this incredible growth in our church, especially bishops. It began with Bishop Vladimir, but more particularly Bishop Nicholas, and then St. Tikhon oversaw an incredible expansion of Orthodoxy. How do they do? Well, we're going to talk about this now. Missionary conversion of the successful and unsuccessful type. So we'll come to the let's do the unsuccessful first. Let's do the ones that are crazy. The crazy converts are the bad story, actually. This is what went wrong in the 19th century. The converts were nuts, okay? And I'll tell you what, they make him look normal. They make him look not so bad, okay? That's how bad it was, okay? So let's tell some stories. The first American convert priest, this story is told in this book right here. Oh my gosh. He was born in 1831 as an Episcopalian. His name was Father James Crystal. He was American born. You've entered the Episcopal zone. That'll be a theme tonight. You'll see Episcopal stuff. Watch out, you know. Okay. He was ordained an Episcopal deacon at age 28, which is normal, I suppose. He was Episcopalian. I was ordained at 27. That's normal, I guess. He was obsessed, though, with one issue, proper baptism. Just like that other guy we just mentioned. He came to believe that only the Orthodox Church had preserved the ancient form and theology of true Christian baptism. He's like, sprinkling is wrong. You know, he read Greek. He knows that baptizo means to immerse. And he understood this, as we do. And in Orthodoxy, we preserve the ideal as we immerse, though we can pour. We're okay with that too. Orthodoxy has a very broad view of these things. He didn't understand any of that because he had no theological training in Orthodoxy. But anyway, Crystal found a random bishop in Greece who impressed him. He impressed the bishop with his knowledge of theology. The bishop liked him. He's like, oh, cool, American Orthodox. The guy wants to be Orthodox. Awesome. A nice Greek bishop. And he baptized him in 1868 according to the pure Orthodox rite. And then within a few months, Crystal got him to ordain him a priest. And then an archpriest. Then an archimandrite. I mean, this is crazy. No Orthodox formation. And this guy gets baptized and then ordained and elevated very, very quickly. What's going to happen here?
Crash and burn.
Crash and burn. He later decided that icons were just too much.
Oh, no!
Having traveled in Greece for like a year and seen icons everywhere, having been baptized in a Greek Orthodox church, he decides icons are too much and then creates his own Baptist sect. This is so American. He then later on decides that he must rejoin the Episcopal Church and then dies Episcopalian in Jersey City in 1908.
Comes full circle.
He comes full circle back. Again, the sort of Episcopal alert, you know. Lord have mercy. Okay, so this is the first disastrous American Orthodox convert priest. Okay, let's do the second one, who's also a disaster. Father Nicholas Bering was born in Denmark, same year as Father James. He was Roman Catholic. He was immigrating to America in 1868, so he's a young man in his 30s immigrating. He rejected papal infallibility because the Vatican I Council was what was that? 1870.
1871.
He rejected that council, as many thoughtful people did, but he didn't want to be a Protestant either. So he was stuck. What do I do? I'm not Catholic. I'm not Protestant. Well, what'll I do? He actually thought about becoming Episcopalian. But anyway, he visited St. Petersburg, was chrismated, and then immediately ordained by the Russian bishop there. He was made an archpriest and then told to found a mission parish in New York City. That all happened within days. Days. So he goes to New York City. He founds Holy Trinity Chapel in 1871. And what we know from the record is that cradles would go to this parish and they walk in and they'd be like, what the heck's going on here? this isn't Orthodoxy. He didn't know any of the chants. He made an iconostas that looked kind of like a Russian church, except he forgot to put deacon's doors in the altar. So you only had the royal doors. I mean, it was everything. He did Holy Week services, but didn't know how to do them, and didn't know what happened in Holy Week. And this is what happens when you ordain somebody without training, without preparation. And so it was a total disaster. The cradles would not go. And to make matters worse, he discouraged conversions. So what was the point, right? The cradles wouldn't go. He didn't like converts because, here we go, Episcopalian. He wanted to be a bridge between Episcopal Church and Orthodoxy. That was his mission. He wanted to bring the Episcopalians into Orthodoxy, keeping their rights, but helping to be that kind of glue. That was his. I don't know why he thought this was a good idea, or why he's the one to do it. Look, it is a good idea. I'm okay. Let's bring in everybody. That's not a problem. But he didn't have the tools to attract the Orthodox or to attract the Episcopalians because he was neither fish nor fowl. So he saw himself as an ambassador, not a missionary. He was a huge fan of the social gospel. And eventually, he left the Russian church to become a Presbyterian, to do like soup kitchens or whatever, which is great, but not what Orthodox priests are called to do first. And then he eventually got tired of it all and became a Roman Catholic again. So he experienced all of this in his life. It sounds like someone from Asbury almost, doesn't it? It's like a crazy story. Sorry. All right. I'm sorry. It's like an Asbury tale. Here we go. Okay, now let's try something else. Let's try the Western Rite. So in 1891, this story takes place. But anyway, we forget how upset people were about Rome in Vatican I. A lot of people were upset, including this guy. His name was Vilat. Joseph René Vilat was born in Paris in 1854. He was a Roman Catholic, not surprisingly. But in the 1880s, he became a Presbyterian missionary. I don't know how or why, but he became a missionary to French-speaking Belgians in Wisconsin, of all places. And he goes there and starts doing this work, but then he misses the Catholic Church. And so he becomes friends with Episcopalians and old Catholics and tries to figure out how to make himself more old Catholic, more Episcopalian or whatever. So then he's like, you know what? I want to be bishop. But they would not ordain him. They would not ordain him. Maybe the Russians will ordain me bishop. So he goes to the Russians. He invites Bishop, I believe it's Vladimir, yeah? One of his last acts before he's sent back to Russia, Bishop Vladimir visits Wisconsin in 1891 and attested to the orthodoxy of Vilat. He interviewed him. He met him. And, well, this is funny, though. There's a letter from Bishop Vladimir to the Russian chancery about this meeting. But what's funny is the Russians have no record of this. Only Vilat has record of it. So it's quite likely he forwards a letter saying that Bishop Vladimir approved him as an Orthodox priest and bishop, or was willing to ordain him bishop. But there's no evidence that the Russian church ever received that document. And Matthew Namy, I didn't look at the Russian original, but he said if you look at the translation into English, it's pretty clear it wasn't written in Russian. It's written in English style, not in a Russian typical decree form. So he thinks it's a spurious letter and not legitimate. But anyway, this guy might be forging papers to get himself made bishop. Did he or did he not? We don't know. We'll never know. But when Bishop Nicholas, the new bishop, visited the next 1892, he wants to go see Vilat in Wisconsin because he's in the area, and Vilat's gone. He's disappeared. He's getting ordained by the Malankara Syriac Church in India. And his dream was to become a bishop. He got his dream fulfilled. He was ordained, and he spent the rest of his life as a Vagante bishop, just enjoying the fact that he had apostolic succession. That was his goal. Just like the guy with baptism, he had to have the perfect baptism. This guy wanted an apostolic so he could be a legitimate bishop in his own eyes. So this is the kind of stuff you see, and you see traces of this in convertism today, right? This kind of like, I'm obsessed with some aspect of ancient church. I want incense, or I want apostolic succession, I want Eucharist, I want right baptism. And what you find in all these stories is they're not concerned with actually being Orthodox, with actually accepting the whole enchilada of our faith. And that's where converts get into trouble a lot, especially when you encounter Orthodoxy in isolation academically or online or something. You can take out pieces of it and make it what you want out of it. and ignore the communal aspects of it, which are inherently ascetical. And I mean, your will, you can't do your own will. This guy wanted to do what he wanted. These priests wanted what they wanted, and they got ordained. They got what, this is a massive spiritual problem that we see in early Orthodoxy, especially with the converts, and we still see today. So, these are my 3 little stories about that. Any questions about these converts or that era? There are lots more stories in the book. I only pulled out 3. Yeah, Jack.
So did Milosh remain in the Malankara church, or did he become Episcopalian?
He became old Catholic, independent. Independent old Catholic. So he styled himself a bishop. He dressed as a bishop to the end of his days. He had a parish or 2, but he was basically a Protestant who used Catholic stuff, And he used the ordination to justify his being a real bishop. Because, this actually brings to the question of what is apostolicity. For the Orthodox, it's not just the magic of laying on hands. That's silliness for us. For us, it's physical laying on of hands, but it's also the carrying over of the faith in continuity with community to community. So, it's not magic. Other questions? All right.
They would have made good televangelists back in the day.
Oh my gosh. These 3 guys are terrible. Okay. So let's look at the timeline here. Okay, we'll go through this a bit as we need to. 1860, founding the Holy Trinity parishes. Both of those parishes, here we have photos of them both. Father George Wilson in New Orleans and our parish, OCA Parish in San Francisco. Lovely, lovely church. Beautiful place. And then, of course, the USA Pershing in Alaska, the Russian Orthodox Diocese establishing itself in San Francisco, and becoming the see. This is the old Cathedral of San Francisco before the fire. This is the new one after the fire, our OCA Cathedral. And then St. Alexis taught. He arrived in America from Austria-Hungary in 1889. He is, at that time, a middle-aged man, sort of in my age bracket. I think he was in his 40s. He had been a lifelong Byzantine Catholic in Austria-Hungary on the border of what is now Ukraine and Slovakia. He was from Uzhgorod, which is currently actually in Ukraine. But it's that area that always goes back and forth between different countries. But he was there, and he always knew that his people were Orthodox long ago, before the 1600s, but they had become Byzantine Rite Catholics during the Union of Brest, in which the people of Austria-Hungary were forced to go under the Pope. And so they had priests who dressed like Orthodox priests, who did Orthodox rites, but were in union with Rome. And he didn't like that, even though he was one of them. And when his wife died and his daughter died. They had married priests in that church, in that area. When they died, he was crestfallen and he wanted a new start. His people, half the village, had gone to America to start a new life in Minneapolis. Where's that? Well, Minnesota. And so they said, "Father, please come join us. We need a priest. We're desperate. We don't have our rights. We want to have a priest of our own faith, our own tradition. Come join us." And so he did. He was done with life. So he goes, and when he gets there, they're like sheep without a shepherd. And so he begins to function as a spiritual father. But of course, being Catholic, you have to go to the Catholic bishop to get a blessing to serve. And so he goes to Bishop John Ireland to get a blessing to serve. Bishop John, he was the bishop of Minneapolis. And I'm going to read the encounter here between them. So St. Alexis arrives to get a blessing to serve. Father Toth arrived in America to serve the newly established St. Mary's Greek Catholic Church in Minneapolis. According to custom, the new priest was to present himself to the local Catholic bishop, Bishop John Ireland, who was an Irish-American prelate. Toth later described their encounter in his memoirs. He said, "I remember that no sooner did he, Ireland, read that I was a uniot than his hands began to shake. It took him 15 minutes to read to the end, after which he asked abruptly, we spoke in Latin, 'Have you a wife?' I said, 'No.' 'But you had one.' 'Yes, I'm a widower.' At this, Bishop Ireland threw the paper down and loudly exclaimed, 'I have already written to Rome protesting against this kind of priest being sent to me. "What kind of priest do you mean?" I asked. "Your kind." He said, I said, "I am a Catholic priest of the Greek rite. I am a union. I was ordained by a lawful Catholic bishop." Bishop Ireland replied, "I do not consider either you or this bishop to be really Catholic. Besides, I do not need any uniate priest here. A Polish priest from Minneapolis is quite sufficient. The Greek Catholics can also have him to be their priest." I replied, "He belongs to the Latin rite. Our people do not understand Latin. They will hardly go to him. That is why they built a church here on their own." The bishop said, "I gave them no such permission to build a church. I shall grant you no permission to serve them either." The archbishop lost his temper. I lost mine as much. One word brought another, so that the thing had gone so far that our further conversation was not worth putting on the record. He writes. And it continues, unable to secure recognition from Bishop Ireland, St. Alexis, this is the narrative here, began to travel to other Greek Catholic parishes asking help. One trustee, a layman named John Milner, was sent to San Francisco to determine if the Russian bishop could be of help to them. After being graciously received by the bishop there, an excited Milner returned to Minneapolis with a generous donation of gifts and icons and money from the missionary diocese to help the struggling Uniat parish. What a nice thing to do. A correspondence between Bishop St. Alexis and Bishop Nicholas ensued. A short time later, Toth and his community of 361 people in Minneapolis were received into the Orthodox Church by confession of faith, not even chrismation. They were confessed and received back into Holy Orthodoxy. So that's kind of his story. It began a flood of conversions. It's over 100,000 people entered the church through his ministry, St. Alexis Toth on the right. He was an incredibly wonderful priest, a very kind man. He would not become, they asked him to become bishop, he declined. He was known for being quite a funny man. He liked to smoke cigars and play pool. He cussed like a sailor, but he would give his life for you. That was who he was. And when the parish was poor, he made bread to keep the parish afloat. He had no problem taking odd jobs. He was a true servant of his people. He once said, once his wife and child died, these people were his family, and his whole life was for them. And so he lived that way. What a very holy, wonderful person. He was canonized in the 90s, I believe. His body was incorrupt at St. Tikhon's. Also in this time, we have Greeks coming in. A lot of Greeks coming from Turkey, Ottoman Empire, and from the newly established land of Greece. And it's worth noting just the different experience they had. There were cultural differences between the Greeks and the Slavs coming into our land. Upon arrival in America, Slavs quickly dispersed to the coal mines in Pennsylvania and the related industries in the Midwest, like steel, etc. Greek immigrants, however, remained profoundly urban. In 1920, fully 80% of all Greeks lived in urban areas, with the majority of them in New York, Chicago, or Boston. Unlike the Slavs, who relied on the poor but steady wages of industry, Greeks sought immediate economic independence through creation of small businesses. The Greek grocery shop, flower shop, shoe shine stand, and candy store are largely in the past, but the Greek restaurants remain even to this day. It is unclear why rural peasant Greeks went into business, while rural peasant Slavs did not. Nevertheless, small Greek businesses, labor-intensive and requiring relatively little capital, became dominant and self-perpetuating in the Greek community, as one immigrant generation provided employment for the next, and so on. The tendency to cluster, both in economic and geographical terms, made Greeks, though, easy targets for occasional anti-immigration sentiment, the nativist sentiment, as they called it. In 1909, for instance, a bill was submitted to Rhode Island's legislature to prohibit non-citizens, that is Greeks, from offshore fishing. A more tragic incident occurred in 1912 in Omaha, Nebraska, when a Greek transient killed a policeman. Within days, all Greek-owned businesses had been burned to the ground. The entire Greek community of 1,200 persons was forced to leave the city. There are stories like this all over America 100 years ago. In fact, in Nicholasville in the 50s, there was a Klan outbreak here. It sounds like a disease. And they were burning crosses in the Catholic Church's yard here in town, St. Luke. And also there was a Greek family here that owned a restaurant in the area, and they had a cross burned in their yard here in Nicholasville back in the 1950s. So this is part of our story and part of our people's struggle. So it's worth pondering all of that as we consider this era in our history. So St. Tikhon arrives in 1898 and serves for 9 years. Who was he? He was an incredible leader for our church. He was, my favorite town in Russia is his hometown called Pskov, P-S-K-O-V, Pskov. You can find his father's grave there. I went to his father's grave in Pskov. He was so smart and so dynamic as a little boy. In Russia, they have these things called училища, and they're church schools for future priests. And so if you're like a middle schooler or high school, you go to училище and like study church topics in preparation for seminary. So it's like a trade school for future priests. And he went to this училище, and while he was there, they called him Маленький Patriarch, the little patriarch, because he was so smart and so fun, and everyone loved him. He was cute and nice, and he was known for his warmth as a human being. So from the time he was a kid, and he was very charismatic. And he became a bishop at a very young age, a teacher, and eventually learned English. And they said, you're a perfect candidate for America because you're very traditional, but you're also open to the West and English and all these things. And these are 3 pictures of him when he was young as our bishop. And you can just see the energy he brings to this office. And he set a great vision for, more Episcopalians, sorry. He was actually very ecumenical with the Episcopalians because he thought there was a chance they could enter the Orthodox Church. He worked with them very carefully. He's over on the side. And by the way, is he investments? No. He's a monastic garb. This is monastic garb for everybody, actually. This was a way he could show he was with them without concelebrating with them. So that's St. Tikhon, that's St. Sebastian behind him, the little guy poking out, and then St. John Kucherov, 3 saints at this conference with the Episcopalians, talking about ancient faith, talking about how can Episcopalians become more Orthodox. This was the kind of stuff that they talked about. Anyway, but he was open to dialoguing with American Christians. He cared about them. He took it very seriously. He also wanted to evangelize American people, but more carefully than his predecessors have with those awful clergy decisions. So he had a more slow and steady approach. And he was frankly so busy with the task of the Uniats converting, he didn't have time to do a lot of work on the American converts. So that was part of his thing. Was he just had to focus on getting these new churches built, getting the Uniats in place as Orthodox believers, integrating them into our Orthodox Church in America. So, but he had a great vision for how the church should operate. He wanted to see, his vision was one diocese, but multiple sub-dioceses. So you'd have territorial lands, like you'd have a diocese of Chicago in the Midwest, you'd have the South, you'd have New York. But you'd also have a diocese for the Arabs. So they'd have a bishop who spoke Arabic. You'd have a diocese for the Serbs who spoke Serbian. You'd have a diocese for the Romanians and for the Greeks. And that was his vision. Actually, by the time he left America, he had succeeded in bringing Father Sebastian to the cusp of being ordained a bishop. It didn't happen because of some complications with World War I, but he would become bishop for the Serbs. He was a native-born American, but Serbian-American. And St. Tikhon was close with St. Raphael, Father Raphael, who was ordained a bishop for the Arabs, the Antiochians. And they worked hand in glove together. And St. Raphael was part of his synod of leadership in America. So the Antiochians at this time were part of the organization that became the OCA, where we united in that one body. The Greeks were never part of this, by the way, never. And in fact, St. Tikhon, people might say Tikhon wanted that. He might have wanted it, but he didn't see it happening. In fact, in San Francisco, I just read the letter today, the Greeks let him know that they were starting their own parish, and he gave them a hearty blessing to go. He said, go, I bless it. May you have success under your bishop in Greece. You know, he didn't mind. He didn't fight it. So it's an interesting point. Like he did want to build an American church, but he wasn't an autocrat, and he believed that these groups had to figure out what to do over time, and that they would. He also felt that they needed to be served by people that knew their language. So if you're Arab, you should be able to have a priest that speaks Arabic. If you're Russian, you have a priest that speaks Russian, and so on. So he cared about this a lot. So this was his team, some of his great leaders, all of whom now are canonized, by the way. This is St. John as an older man. St. John is a newly married man. His wife Ekaterina. St. Sebastian Dabovich. So he was martyred in Russia the first day of the revolution. That's St. Alexander Khodovitsky, who was dean of the New York area. St. John was dean of the Chicago area. St. Alexander was in New York, and he built about 10 parishes in New York. And then when he went to Moscow, he was martyred by Stalin in the 1930s. So, and there's St. Raphael and St. Tikhon together. So that was their vision, and they largely succeeded in developing it. What changed it all was the start of World War I and then the Russian Revolution. That created a major problem for the church. We'll talk about that, of course, next week. So, but the real thing to take away from this talk is just the incredible impact of immigration, the incredible impact of the Uniat Christians converting to Orthodoxy. Without that conversion, the OCA would not would not be here right now, because in 1970, over half our parishes directly traced their roots to that conversion experience, which is really interesting. And that's also part of the reason why you get sort of the real Russian Orthodox folks in Rokor were always uneasy with some of our parishes. Why? Because our parishes had some influences from the Unionists, though. They were kind of little Pennsylvania quirks, quirks of the mountains in Austria-Hungary, folk stuff, rather than high Russian Empire. These folks were never part of the Russian Empire. They never were. Because their lands fell to the Austro-Hungarians and Poles before Moscow even rose. So they were ancient Rus, but they were not part of Moscow. So they have a whole different identity, whole different practice, but they remembered their Orthodoxy, they returned to Orthodoxy, and the Russians, and they thought of themselves as Russians, though, because in Austria-Hungary they were called Rus. They're called Rus, so you're Rus. Well, I guess we're Russians, great. So it's kind of weird because nowadays in Ukraine, in the current war, they're very keen to not be Russian. But that's because they were under Soviet domination for so long and under the Russian Empire. The folks in these border regions that were under other tyrants looked to Russia for help. And they liked Russia because Russia was their big brother. Serbs love Russia. These folks love Russia because, well, that's big brother over there. And they will help us and give us the true faith. So it's a very interesting dynamic historically. There's a great story in here. I won't read the story. It's a story of St. Raphael getting in a gunfight. The question is, he was in a gunfight. The question was, did he have a gun or not? There was a debate about, because the Irish Catholic cop claimed that Raphael pulled a gun on him. And St. Raphael says, of course I didn't pull a gun. I'm a priest. I would not have a gun on my person. And we'll never know the true story, but it's hysterical. It's the Melkites versus the Maronites versus the Orthodox Arabs in this almost like a mafia setting. And the poor bishop's trying to make peace, and it all goes crazy, and there's a gunfight. Read in the book. It's really great. There we have it. I think it's a good place to stop. Next week, we're looking at revolution, chaos, and retreat.